Imagine this. You are a child in ancient Sparta. The sun is just rising over the rugged hills, and your world is about to change forever. From your very first breath, your life is a test. Elders gather around to decide if you are strong enough to belong. If not, your story ends before it really begins. But if you are chosen, your journey is only just starting. Now, picture being only 7 years old. Most kids today would be playing outside, maybe chasing each other in the fields or learning their letters. But for you, as a young Spartan, childhood is swept away in a single moment. You are taken from your mother's arms and led into the Agōgē, a place where comfort and softness are left behind. This is not just a school, it is a crucible, designed to shape ordinary boys into the stuff of legend. Every day is a new challenge. Hunger gnaws at your belly, but you quickly learn that asking for more is pointless. Instead, you and your friends, your new brothers, become clever, sneaking food when you can. If you are caught, the punishment is harsh, but not for stealing. No, you are punished for failing to be sly enough. Every lesson is about survival, about never showing weakness, about growing sharper in mind and body. What really makes this story fascinating is the secret side of Spartan life. Did you know there was a group called the Krypteia? These were like the secret agents of ancient Sparta, made up of older boys who were chosen for their skill and ruthlessness. Their mission was to patrol the countryside, keeping order, and it was all part of their training. It is a detail that shows just how deeply discipline and loyalty were woven into Spartan society. Yet the Agōgē was not only about toughness. Amid the hardship, boys learned music, poetry, and debate. The Spartans believed a true warrior needed a mind as sharp as his spear. Even the girls trained in running and wrestling, because strong mothers meant strong sons. It is one of the rare places in ancient Greece where women were encouraged to be powerful in their own right. All of this leads to a single question. Why did Sparta believe this was the only path to greatness? For them, the answer was simple. Only the strongest could defend their city, and only the most disciplined could stand together in the face of impossible odds. The result was an army that became legendary, standing firm at places like Thermopylae, where a few hundred Spartans held the line against an empire. But behind every legend, there is a cost. What was it like to grow up in a world where mercy was weakness and emotion was discouraged? Was the price of greatness too high? These are the stories and secrets we are about to explore together. So, if you love uncovering the mysteries of the past and want to know what life was really like for those who walked before us, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. Because the ancient world still has so much to teach us, and the story of the Spartan Agōgē is just the beginning. Picture this. In the mountains of ancient Greece, around 700 years before Christ, there lived a society unlike any other in human history. While other Greek cities celebrated art, philosophy, and commerce, Sparta had chosen a different path entirely. They had decided that their greatest masterpiece would not be carved from marble or written in verse, but forged from human flesh and willpower. The story begins not with glory or conquest, but with something far more chilling, the examination of a newborn child. Imagine being a new mother in Sparta, holding your baby for the first time, knowing that within days, a group of elderly men would arrive at your door. These weren't doctors or midwives coming to celebrate new life. They were inspectors, tasked with one of the most heartbreaking duties imaginable. The elders would take your child, unwrap the swaddling clothes, and examine every limb, every feature, every sign of strength or weakness. They were looking for physical defects, signs of illness, or anything that might suggest this child would not become the perfect warrior Sparta demanded. If they found the baby wanting in any way, the sentence was swift and final. The child would be carried to the slopes of Mount Taygetos, the towering mountain that watched over Sparta like a stone guardian, and left there to face the elements alone. This practice, known as exposure, wasn't unique to Sparta, but nowhere else was it carried out with such systematic thoroughness. The Spartans believed they were being merciful, both to the child and to society. A weak child, they reasoned, would suffer throughout life and burden the community. Better to end that suffering quickly than to allow it to fester. For the children who passed this first terrible test, life in Sparta began much like anywhere else. They would spend their earliest years with their mothers, learning to walk and talk, playing simple games, and experiencing the warmth of family life. Spartan mothers were known throughout Greece for their strength and fierce devotion to their city. Unlike women in Athens or other Greek cities, who lived largely secluded lives, Spartan women exercised, participated in religious festivals, and held significant influence in their households. These mothers knew something that would break the heart of any parent in the modern world. Their time with their sons was desperately limited. Every day they spent teaching their boys to speak. Every night they tucked them into bed. Every moment of tenderness and care was borrowed time. Because when a Spartan boy reached his 7th birthday, everything would change forever. The day would come without ceremony or celebration. There would be no grand announcement, no time to prepare emotionally. Representatives of the state would simply arrive and inform the family that the time had come. The boy would be taken from his home, from his mother's embrace, from everything familiar and comforting, and delivered into an institution that would reshape every aspect of his being. This wasn't like sending a child to boarding school or even to serve as a page in a noble household, practices common in other parts of the ancient world. The Agōgē, as this system was called, was something entirely different. It was a machine designed to strip away everything that made a child soft, vulnerable, or dependent, and replace it with iron discipline, unquestioning obedience, and an absolute commitment to Spartan values. The word Agōgē itself means leading or guidance, but these terms hardly capture the reality of what these 7-year-old boys were about to experience. They would be grouped together with other boys their age, forming what the Spartans called a herd. Even the terminology reveals how the Spartans viewed this process. These weren't students or pupils, but animals to be trained and shaped. The boys would be assigned to an older youth, typically around 20 years old, who would serve as their leader and instructor. This young man, having recently completed his own Agōgē training, understood exactly what lay ahead for his charges. He had survived the same brutal process and now carried the responsibility of ensuring these new boys would do the same, or die trying. From the moment they entered the Agōgē, these children learned that their old lives were over. They would not return home for visits. They would not receive letters or gifts from their families. Their mothers, despite the pain of separation, were expected to show pride in their son's new path. Any display of grief or reluctance was seen as weakness, both in the mother and potentially in the child. The Spartan mothers had a saying that would echo through history: "Return with your shield or on it." This wasn't merely a dramatic expression of military bravado. In the world these boys were entering, there truly were only 2 acceptable outcomes: victory or death. Surrender, retreat, or even survival without honor was considered worse than dying in battle. As these 7-year-old boys took their first steps into the Agōgē, they were beginning a journey that would last for 13 years. 13 years of hardship, pain, and constant testing that would either forge them into the most feared warriors in the ancient world or break them entirely. Those who survived would emerge as Spartan citizens, inheritors of a military tradition that would make their small city-state the dominant power in Greece. But those who failed, who couldn't endure the brutal training or who showed weakness at crucial moments, would face a fate perhaps worse than the exposure practiced on infants. They would become outcasts in their own society, neither citizen nor slave, forever marked as inadequate in a culture that valued nothing more than martial excellence. This was the beginning of the Agōgē, the point where childhood ended and the forging of a Spartan warrior began. What happened next would test every aspect of human endurance and reveal truths about the nature of strength, community, and the price of military perfection that continue to fascinate and horrify us to this day. Now imagine you're one of these 7-year-old boys, fresh from your mother's care, suddenly thrust into a world where the rules of survival have completely changed. The first lesson the Agōgē taught wasn't about sword fighting or shield formations. It was about hunger, and how that gnawing emptiness in your stomach could become either your greatest weakness or your most powerful teacher. The Spartans had discovered something that modern psychology would later confirm. When you're comfortable, when all your needs are met, you don't grow. You don't push boundaries, you don't innovate, and you certainly don't develop the kind of desperate resourcefulness that separates survivors from victims. So they made sure their boys were never, ever comfortable. The daily rations provided to the Agōgē students were deliberately insufficient. Not enough to cause serious malnutrition or permanent damage, but certainly not enough to satisfy a growing boy's appetite. This wasn't an oversight or a result of limited resources. Sparta was actually quite wealthy, controlling vast territories and having access to abundant food supplies. The hunger was intentional, carefully calculated to create a specific response. When your stomach is empty and your body is crying out for nourishment, something primal awakens inside you. Your senses sharpen, your mind becomes focused on a single goal, and you start to see opportunities that well-fed people miss entirely. The Spartans understood this transformation and wanted to make it permanent in their future warriors. But here's where the genius and the cruelty of the system truly revealed itself. The boys weren't just left to starve. They were told, in no uncertain terms, that if they were clever enough, brave enough, and skilled enough, they could supplement their meager rations. The solution was theft, but not the kind of random pilfering you might expect from desperate children. The art of stealing in the Agōgē was elevated to something approaching a science. Boys learned to move silently through the darkness, to observe patterns in adult behavior, to identify the most vulnerable targets, and to strike at the perfect moment when discovery was least likely. They studied the routines of citizens, the habits of merchants, the schedules of guards. They learned to work in teams, with some boys serving as lookouts while others carried out the actual theft. This wasn't just about acquiring food. The Spartans were teaching these children skills that would prove invaluable in warfare: reconnaissance, patience, timing, teamwork, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. A warrior who could steal bread from a baker's shop without being detected could just as easily infiltrate an enemy camp to gather intelligence or sabotage supplies. But the truly brilliant and terrifying aspect of this system was what happened when a boy was caught in the act. You might expect that stealing would be punished as a crime, that boys caught taking food would face consequences for their dishonesty. Instead, something far more psychologically complex occurred. When a boy was caught stealing, he wasn't beaten for the theft itself. The crime wasn't taking something that didn't belong to him. The crime was being clumsy enough, careless enough, or unlucky enough to get caught. The punishment was for failure, not for the attempt. This distinction fundamentally rewired how these children thought about morality, risk, and success. The message was clear and chilling. In the world you're preparing for, results matter more than methods. A successful theft demonstrated skill, planning, and courage. An unsuccessful one revealed weakness and incompetence. The Spartans were teaching their boys that in war, in politics, in life itself, only outcomes mattered. The victor writes the rules, and the defeated suffer the consequences. This philosophy extended far beyond simple food theft. As the boys grew older and more skilled, their assignments became increasingly complex and morally challenging. They might be tasked with gathering information about specific citizens, testing the defenses of important buildings, or even observing and reporting on the activities of Sparta's helot population. The helots were the foundation upon which Spartan society rested, yet they were also its greatest potential threat. These were people who had once been free, whose ancestors had lived in the lands that Sparta now controlled. They vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, sometimes by ratios of 7 or 10 to 1. They worked the fields, crafted the goods, and performed the labor that allowed Spartan men to dedicate their lives entirely to warfare and governance. But the Spartans never forgot that the helots were enslaved people with every reason to hate their masters. Rebellion was always a possibility, and the fear of helot uprising haunted Spartan dreams. This fear shaped many aspects of Spartan culture, but perhaps nowhere was it more evident than in the creation of the Krypteia. The word Krypteia comes from the Greek word meaning hidden or secret, and that's exactly what this institution was. A shadowy organization that operated in the spaces between official Spartan society. The Krypteia served multiple purposes, but its most notorious function was as a training ground for the most promising young Spartans and as a tool for controlling the helot population through fear. Young men who had excelled in the Agōgē, who had shown not just physical prowess but also intelligence, ruthlessness, and absolute loyalty to Sparta, might be selected for the Krypteia. This selection was both an honor and a test, a recognition of their abilities and a final examination of their commitment to Spartan values. Members of the Krypteia would be sent out into the countryside, often alone, with minimal supplies and a terrible mission. They were to live off the land, avoid detection by both citizens and helots, and observe the slave population for signs of potential trouble. But observation wasn't their only duty. They were also empowered to eliminate any helot who seemed particularly strong, intelligent, or capable of leadership. This wasn't random violence or uncontrolled brutality. It was a calculated strategy designed to prevent the emergence of helot leaders who might organize resistance against Spartan rule. By systematically removing the most capable individuals from the enslaved population, the Spartans hoped to keep the helots docile and leaderless. The young men chosen for this duty were being tested in ways that went far beyond physical courage or military skill. They were being asked to become instruments of state policy, to set aside personal feelings or moral qualms in service of what they had been taught was the greater good of Sparta. This was perhaps the most sophisticated and disturbing aspect of Spartan education. The creation of individuals who could commit acts of calculated cruelty while believing themselves to be serving justice. For the boys still working their way through the earlier stages of the Agōgē, stories of the Krypteia served as both inspiration and warning. It represented the pinnacle of Spartan achievement, proof that the system could create young men of extraordinary capability. But it also demonstrated the ultimate destination of their education. A place where human compassion had been replaced by cold calculation, where the needs of the state trumped all other considerations. As these hungry, desperate boys learned to steal bread in the darkness, they were taking their first steps on a path that might one day lead them to far more serious crimes committed in service of their city. The art of theft they were mastering wasn't just about survival. It was preparation for a life where the greatest virtue was the ability to do whatever Sparta required, no matter the cost to themselves or others. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. As the years passed in the Agōgē, something remarkable began to happen among these boys who had been torn from their families and thrust into this harsh world. The hunger, the cold nights sleeping on beds of reeds, the constant testing and competition gradually forged bonds between them that went deeper than friendship, stronger than brotherhood. These weren't just classmates or training partners anymore. They were becoming something the Spartans had a special word for: sworn companions who would live and die together. The relationships formed in the Agōgē weren't built on shared interests or casual affection like the friendships we know today. They were forged in the crucible of shared suffering, mutual dependence, and the knowledge that your survival might one day depend entirely on the boy standing next to you. When you've stolen food together, covered for each other's mistakes, and helped each other endure punishment, you develop a connection that most people never experience in their entire lives. But perhaps the most intense and defining aspect of Agōgē life was the constant combat training that began almost from the moment the boys arrived. This wasn't the structured, safety-conscious martial arts instruction we might imagine. The Spartans believed that you couldn't truly learn to fight unless you actually fought, with real consequences and genuine stakes. Picture the training grounds. A dusty courtyard surrounded by stone walls, with groups of boys ranging from 7 to 20 years old engaged in various forms of combat. The younger boys might be wrestling, learning to use their bodies as weapons, discovering how to leverage an opponent's strength against him. The older ones practiced with wooden swords and shields, their movements becoming more fluid and deadly with each passing day. The elders would watch these sessions with the intensity of craftsmen examining their work. They weren't just looking for physical prowess, though strength and speed were certainly important. They were studying each boy's character, observing how he responded to pain, how he treated defeated opponents, how he handled both victory and defeat. Did he show mercy when he had the advantage? Did he give up when overwhelmed? Did he fight with calculated intelligence or merely brute force? What made this training truly extraordinary was its psychological dimension. The boys weren't just learning techniques. They were being conditioned to see violence as natural, necessary, and even beautiful when properly executed. The Spartans had developed an aesthetic of combat that treated skilled fighting as an art form worthy of admiration and study. The competitions between boys could become genuinely dangerous. While outright killing wasn't encouraged in routine training, serious injuries were considered part of the learning process. A broken bone taught lessons about proper technique and the consequences of mistakes that no amount of theoretical instruction could provide. The boys learned to fight through pain, to continue functioning even when injured, and to view their own physical suffering as simply another obstacle to overcome. But here's where the true genius of Spartan education reveals itself, and where many people's understanding of the Agōgē becomes incomplete. Yes, the Spartans were creating warriors of extraordinary physical capability, but they understood something that many military cultures throughout history have missed. The most dangerous opponent isn't just strong and fast and fearless. The most dangerous opponent can think. While other Greek cities might focus their education entirely on either physical training or intellectual development, the Spartans insisted on both. These boys who spent their days learning to kill with their hands also spent their evenings learning to craft words like weapons. They studied poetry, not just as an appreciation of beauty, but as a tool for understanding rhythm, timing, and the power of language to move people's hearts and minds. The poetry they learned wasn't flowery verses about love and nature. Spartan poetry was lean, powerful, and often focused on themes of duty, sacrifice, and military glory. They memorized epic tales of heroic deeds, learning not just the stories themselves, but the techniques poets used to make those stories memorable and inspiring. A Spartan warrior needed to be able to encourage his companions with stirring words, to deliver clear commands in the chaos of battle, and to represent his city with dignity when dealing with foreign ambassadors. Music served a similar dual purpose in Spartan education. On one level, it was about cultural refinement and the ability to participate in religious ceremonies and civic celebrations. But the Spartans also understood music's practical military applications, the ability to keep time, to coordinate movements with others, to maintain rhythm even when exhausted or afraid. These skills were essential for maintaining formation in battle. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, was perhaps the most sophisticated subject in the Spartan curriculum. These boys learned to construct logical arguments, to identify weaknesses in their opponent's reasoning, and to present their ideas with clarity and force. But Spartan rhetoric had its own distinctive character. It valued brevity over elaboration, substance over style, and direct truth over clever wordplay. This emphasis on concise, powerful communication gave rise to what we now call laconic speech, named after Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. Spartans became famous throughout the ancient world for their ability to say exactly what they meant in as few words as possible. When Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, sent a threatening message to Sparta saying, "If I enter Laconia, I will raze Sparta to the ground," the Spartan reply was a single word: if. This integration of physical and intellectual training created warriors who were far more formidable than simple fighters. They could adapt to changing circumstances, devise strategies on the battlefield, and function as leaders when necessary. The combination of absolute physical courage with sharp intelligence made them nearly unstoppable in combat. But there's another aspect of Spartan society that contributed to the effectiveness of the Agōgē system, something that often gets overlooked in discussions of ancient Greek culture: The role of Spartan women. While women in Athens and most other Greek cities lived largely secluded lives, prohibited from participating in athletics or appearing in public without male supervision, Spartan women enjoyed freedoms that wouldn't be matched in most of Europe until modern times. Spartan girls didn't attend the Agōgē, but they had their own rigorous training program. They participated in athletic competitions, including running, wrestling, and javelin throwing. They learned to read and write, studied music and poetry, and were encouraged to speak their minds on matters of public importance. Most remarkably, they were expected to maintain their physical fitness throughout their lives, even after marriage and childbirth. This wasn't some early experiment in gender equality. The Spartans had discovered through observation and experience that strong, intelligent, confident mothers were more likely to produce strong, intelligent, confident sons. They understood that courage, determination, and physical capability were at least partially inherited traits, and they wanted to ensure that the mothers of future warriors possessed these qualities in abundance. Spartan women were also known for their directness and their refusal to accept weakness or cowardice from their sons. The stories of Spartan mothers telling their sons to return from battle either victorious or dead weren't exaggerations. These women had been raised in a culture that valued honor above life itself, and they passed these values on to their children with unwavering consistency. The relationship between the Agōgē system and the broader Spartan society was symbiotic. The training program didn't exist in isolation. It was supported and reinforced by every aspect of Spartan culture. The boys knew that their mothers expected excellence from them, that their sisters were training to become equally formidable women, and that their entire community was organized around the principle that individual wants and needs were always secondary to collective strength and survival. This created a feedback loop that made the Agōgē extraordinarily effective. The boys weren't just trying to meet the expectations of their instructors. They were trying to live up to the standards of an entire civilization that had chosen to define itself through military excellence. The pressure was enormous, but so was the support. Every citizen had a stake in their success, and every institution in their society was designed to help them achieve it. As these boys progressed through their teenage years, growing stronger and more skilled with each passing season, they began to understand that they weren't just learning to fight. They were learning to embody an ideal that had shaped their people for generations. They were becoming living representatives of everything Sparta believed about strength, honor, and the proper way to live a human life. After 11 years of relentless training, hunger, combat, and education, the boys who had entered the Agōgē as frightened 7-year-olds were now 18 and approaching manhood. They had survived everything the system could throw at them: the bitter cold of winter nights spent with only thin cloaks for warmth, the gnawing hunger that had taught them to see opportunity in every shadow, the countless fights that had hardened their bodies and sharpened their reflexes. But the Spartans had saved the most demanding test for last. The final trial wasn't about skill with weapons or tactical knowledge or even physical strength in the conventional sense. It was about something far more fundamental: the ability to endure suffering without breaking, to maintain dignity and composure in the face of agony, and to demonstrate that the mind could triumph over the body's desperate pleas for relief. This ceremony took place at one of the most sacred locations in Sparta, the altar of Artemis Orthia, a goddess who held special significance for the Spartan people. Artemis was known throughout the Greek world as the goddess of the hunt, of wild animals, and of young people making the transition to adulthood. But in Sparta, she had taken on an additional role as the divine witness to human endurance and the patron of those who could transcend physical limitations through pure willpower. The altar itself was ancient, carved from stone and weathered by centuries of ceremonies. It stood in a sanctuary that had been sacred long before Sparta became the military power that would dominate Greece. Archaeological evidence suggests that rituals involving tests of endurance had been conducted at this site for hundreds of years, evolving over time into the final examination that would determine whether a young man was worthy of Spartan citizenship. The ceremony, known as the Diamastagosis, was both a religious ritual and a public spectacle. Citizens would gather to witness this ultimate test, bringing their own children so they could see what was expected of those who would defend their city. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and reverence, as everyone present understood they were witnessing something profound, the moment when boys either proved themselves worthy of joining Sparta's elite or revealed themselves to be inadequate to the task. The young men who would face this trial had been preparing for it mentally for years. They knew it was coming, knew what it would require of them, and had spent countless hours conditioning themselves not just physically but psychologically for what lay ahead. Some had developed meditation techniques to separate their minds from their body's sensations. Others had practiced focusing on abstract concepts or memories that could transport them beyond immediate physical experience. When the day arrived, each candidate would approach the altar alone, stripped to the waist, with nothing to protect him but his own mental fortitude. The implements used in the ceremony were specifically designed for this purpose. Whips that would cause intense pain without inflicting permanent damage, wielded by experienced officials who understood exactly how to calibrate the force of each strike. The test was deceptively simple in its requirements. The young man had to remain upright and silent throughout the ordeal. He could not cry out, could not fall to his knees, could not show any sign that the pain was affecting him. To the observers, he needed to appear as unmoved as if he were standing in a gentle breeze, rather than enduring deliberate, calculated suffering. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this trial was how some young men responded to it. Rather than merely enduring the pain with grim determination, some candidates would actually smile during the flogging. This wasn't madness or some kind of supernatural immunity to pain. It was the ultimate expression of Spartan values, the ability to find joy in proving one's own strength, to experience genuine happiness in demonstrating that no external force could break one's spirit. These smiles weren't forced or artificial. They came from a deep philosophical understanding that the Spartans had cultivated over generations. Pain, they believed, was simply information. It told you that something was happening to your body, but it didn't have to control your emotional state or determine your response. A truly disciplined person could acknowledge pain without being dominated by it, could even find satisfaction in proving their mastery over their own physical sensations. The young men who achieved this level of mental control had discovered something that modern sports psychologists and military trainers still study today: the power of reframing experience through perspective. By viewing the trial not as torture, but as an opportunity to demonstrate excellence, they transformed what could have been a traumatic ordeal into a moment of personal triumph. Not everyone who faced the diamastagosis survived it. The combination of physical stress, psychological pressure, and the young men's own determination to prove themselves sometimes led to tragic outcomes. Some candidates, rather than show weakness by calling for the ceremony to stop, would endure until their bodies simply couldn't continue functioning. These deaths weren't seen as failures of the system, but as the ultimate sacrifice to Spartan ideals. The families of young men who died during the trial were honored rather than pitied. Their sons had chosen death over dishonor, had proven that they possessed the absolute commitment to Spartan values that was the highest achievement possible for a citizen. In a culture that viewed death in battle as the most glorious possible fate, dying during the diamastagosis was seen as achieving that same level of honor through a different path. For those who survived the trial, the moment of completion marked the most significant transformation of their lives. They were no longer students or trainees or candidates. They were full citizens of Sparta, members of an elite brotherhood that had earned its status through demonstrated excellence. The relief and pride they felt wasn't just about ending their suffering, but about proving to themselves and their community that they possessed the fundamental quality that defined a Spartan: unbreakable strength of will. The psychological impact of this experience lasted for the rest of their lives. Men who had faced the diamastagosis and emerged victorious carried with them an unshakable confidence in their ability to endure whatever challenges they might encounter. They had proven to themselves that there was no pain so intense, no pressure so overwhelming, that it could force them to abandon their principles or compromise their dignity. This mental toughness proved invaluable in the military campaigns that defined Spartan history. When these men faced the chaos and terror of battle, when they stood in the narrow pass at Thermopylae facing impossible odds, when they endured long sieges or fought in conditions that would break ordinary soldiers, they drew on the knowledge that they had already faced their worst fears and overcome them. The ceremony also served a crucial social function in Spartan society. It provided a clear, unambiguous standard for citizenship that couldn't be influenced by family connections, wealth, or political favoritism. Either you could endure the trial, or you couldn't. Either you possessed the mental discipline that Sparta required, or you didn't. This created a genuine meritocracy where status was based entirely on demonstrated capability. The religious dimension of the diamastagosis was equally important to its effectiveness. By conducting the trial at a sacred site, in the presence of the goddess Artemis, the Spartans elevated what could have been merely a brutal hazing ritual into something with deep spiritual significance. The young men weren't just proving themselves to their instructors or their families. They were demonstrating their worthiness before the divine powers that protected their city. This sacred context also provided a framework for understanding suffering that made the trial psychologically bearable. The pain wasn't meaningless or arbitrary. It was a form of sacrifice offered to the gods, a way of demonstrating devotion and earning divine favor. This religious interpretation helped the candidates find meaning in their ordeal and connected their individual struggles to the larger spiritual life of their community. As the successful candidates walked away from the altar of Artemis Orthia, they carried with them more than just the satisfaction of personal achievement. They had become part of a tradition that stretched back centuries and would continue for generations to come. They were now qualified to pass on the values and methods that had made Sparta the most feared military power in the ancient world, to serve as examples for the next generation of boys who would follow the same demanding path. The diamastagosis represented the culmination of everything the Agōgē was designed to achieve, the creation of individuals who had transcended normal human limitations through discipline, who valued honor above comfort, and who could find strength in situations that would overwhelm ordinary people. These were the men who would stand unbroken against the vast armies of the Persian Empire, who would maintain their fighting spirit even when facing certain death, and who would create a legacy of courage that would inspire warriors for thousands of years to come. So here we stand, more than 2,000 years later, still trying to understand what the Spartans achieved and what they lost in the process. The Agōgē system produced results that are undeniable and legendary. When King Leonidas and his 300 warriors faced the massive Persian army at Thermopylae in 480 before Christ, they weren't just outnumbered by impossible odds. They were facing an empire that had conquered most of the known world, professional soldiers who had crushed every army they had encountered, and a king who considered himself divine. Yet these Spartan warriors, products of the brutal system we've been exploring, stood their ground with a calmness that amazed even their enemies. When Xerxes demanded that they surrender their weapons, Leonidas reportedly replied, "Come and take them." This wasn't bravado or desperate defiance. It was the natural response of men who had been conditioned from childhood to view death as preferable to dishonor, who had learned to find peace in the midst of chaos, and who genuinely believed that their training had prepared them for exactly this moment. The Agōgē had given them something that no amount of conventional military training could provide: absolute certainty in their own capabilities and complete freedom from the fear that paralyzes ordinary people in extreme situations. They knew they were going to die at Thermopylae, but that knowledge didn't weaken their resolve. If anything, it clarified their purpose and allowed them to focus entirely on making their deaths as meaningful as possible. The impact of their sacrifice rippled through history in ways that continue to shape our world today. The few days they bought with their lives allowed the other Greek cities to organize their defenses, ultimately leading to the defeat of the Persian invasion and the preservation of Greek independence. Without Thermopylae, there might have been no golden age of Athens, no philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, no democratic ideals that would eventually influence modern governments around the world. But as we admire the courage and effectiveness of these ancient warriors, we also have to confront the darker truths about the society that created them. The Agōgē didn't just produce heroes. It produced human beings who had been systematically stripped of many qualities that we consider essential to a full and meaningful life. Think about the cost of creating men who could smile while being tortured, who could kill without hesitation, who could sacrifice their own children to abstract ideals without showing emotion. The same training that made them unbreakable in battle also made them, in many ways, unreachable as human beings. They had learned to suppress empathy, to view compassion as weakness, and to prioritize the needs of the state above every personal relationship and individual desire. The Spartan system was extraordinarily effective at producing warriors, but it was far less successful at creating a sustainable society. The very qualities that made Spartans formidable in combat made them inflexible in peacetime. They struggled to adapt to changing circumstances, to form alliances with other cities, or to develop the economic and cultural innovations that allowed other Greek societies to flourish. More tragically, the demographic cost of the Agōgē system eventually doomed Sparta itself. The brutal training killed many boys before they could become fathers. The constant warfare that was the natural outlet for Spartan military culture consumed many of those who survived. The rigid social structure that elevated warriors above all other occupations discouraged the kind of population growth that healthy societies need to survive. By the time of Alexander the Great, just a century and a half after Thermopylae, Sparta had become a shadow of its former self. The city that had once dominated Greece could barely field an army large enough to defend its own territory. The system that had been designed to create strength had ultimately created a kind of evolutionary dead end. This raises profound questions that go far beyond ancient history. In our own time, we've seen societies that prioritized military strength above all other values, that demanded absolute obedience from their citizens, that viewed individual human feelings and desires as obstacles to collective power. The results have been consistently tragic. Temporary military success followed by social collapse, impressive displays of organized force accompanied by the systematic destruction of human dignity and creativity. Yet we can't simply dismiss everything about the Spartan approach as misguided or evil. The Agōgē taught lessons about human potential that remain relevant today. It demonstrated that people are capable of far more than they usually imagine, that mental discipline can overcome physical limitations, and that shared hardship can create bonds of loyalty and mutual support that are stronger than family ties. Modern military training programs around the world still incorporate principles that the Spartans developed: the use of controlled stress to build resilience, the importance of unit cohesion in maintaining morale under pressure, the value of pushing individuals beyond their perceived limits to help them discover their true capabilities. Elite forces like the Navy SEALs, the British SAS, and similar organizations in other countries all use training methods that would be recognizable to ancient Spartan instructors. The difference is that modern democratic societies have learned to apply these techniques selectively to specific groups of volunteers who choose this path for specific purposes, rather than imposing them on entire populations. We've discovered ways to build mental toughness and physical courage without completely sacrificing the human qualities that make life worth living. Perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the Spartan experience is about the nature of strength itself. The Spartans believed that true strength could only be achieved through the elimination of weakness, that you had to destroy everything soft and vulnerable in human nature to reveal the unbreakable core beneath. But there's another view of strength that sees it not as the absence of vulnerability, but as the ability to remain compassionate and creative, despite knowing how much you can lose. The kind of strength that allows someone to risk their life to save a stranger, to maintain hope in desperate circumstances, to build rather than destroy, to create beauty in the midst of chaos. This might be a more complete and sustainable form of human excellence than what the Agōgē produced. It's a strength that includes courage and discipline, but doesn't require the sacrifice of empathy and individual dignity. When we look at the great moral leaders throughout history, The people who have made the world better rather than just more efficiently organized. We see individuals who combined toughness with tenderness, who were strong enough to be gentle, who had the courage to remain fully human even in inhuman circumstances. These are qualities that the Agōgē, for all its remarkable achievements, could not and did not produce. So what can we learn from this ancient story? Perhaps that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they commit themselves fully to a shared purpose, but that the purpose itself matters as much as the commitment. The Spartans proved that a society can create individuals of incredible capability and dedication, but they also demonstrated the dangers of defining excellence too narrowly, of sacrificing too much in pursuit of a single ideal. Their legacy is complex and contradictory, inspiring and troubling, a reminder both of human potential and of the importance of choosing our goals wisely. The boys who entered the Agōgē at age 7 emerged as men who could change the course of history, but they also emerged as men who had paid a price for their strength that echoes through the centuries, asking us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice for greatness and whether there might be better ways to achieve it. In the end, the story of the Agōgē is not just about ancient Sparta. It's about the eternal human struggle to balance strength with compassion, discipline with creativity, collective purpose with individual dignity. It's a conversation that every generation must have anew, as we try to build societies that can defend themselves without losing their souls, that can create citizens capable of great things without destroying what makes them human. What lessons can we draw from this ancient tradition? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world.